Okay, cool. So let's finish up China. Let's quickly talk about Nixon's visit to China, but focus mainly on Deng Xiaoping. Cool. So in 1972, when Richard Nixon visits China and meets Mao, it was seen as a really dramatic shift in US China relations and Chinese foreign policy in general. Even though the event itself was more sensationalized in the media in a way, because Nixon and Mao actually only met once, it matters much more in the long term because it sort of opened up the window between China and the outside world, basically, right? China had sort of closed itself off, not sort of, it literally had closed itself off to the outside world when Mao took over in 1949. So let's talk about why this matters for Deng Xiaoping's policies, right? So here's some good discussion questions to talk about with your friends. So after Mao dies in 76, when Deng Xiaoping becomes the next leader of the Chinese Communist Party, he really dramatically shifts away from Mao's version of communism, at least in terms of his economic vision. So his four modernizations are all largely sort of bent around still catching up with the West or keeping on pace with the West in some ways, right? So many rural areas in China still didn't have electricity. So that was a major goal of Deng's. And also, he wanted to continue to automate industry to be more productive and take advantage of these new trade opportunities we'll talk about in a second. He also wanted to emphasize spending on science and technology, especially in terms of education, so that this would inspire new innovation. And lastly, he really wanted to beef up the Chinese military. But what's most important, and this is a much broader concept, is that Deng Xiaoping introduced these special economic zones into China. So what they were these zones within mainland China where foreign enterprise could set up shop. So factories that were headquartered in other nations could actually operate out of China and not be held to the same economic regulations as areas outside of these economic zones had to follow. So this led to a major investment in the Chinese economy, right? You see these figures down here. And so this is going to be a major break from the way Mao envisioned communist China. All right, so this isn't literally the fifth modernization. There were only four, but the democracy movement is a really important period during Deng Xiaoping's rule as well. So even though the government shifts from more totalitarian to authoritarian, this isn't obviously enough of a shift, right? Many Chinese people were craving not only an economic liberalization, but a political liberalization. So the best example of this, and this isn't the first time the democracy wall existed, but the democracy wall is really indicative of the democracy movement in the sense that this was a place where Chinese citizens could air their grievances in public. They could issue demands for the Chinese government. The democracy wall was in a very prominent part of Beijing near Tiananmen Square. So this was really major to have this sort of protest be so visible. The most important example and the most well-known example of the democracy movement was the Tiananmen movement, which was in the spring of 1989. And this was largely led by students, and it was just this huge pro-democracy movement. And it unfortunately came to an end on June 4th when the Chinese military opened fire on the protesters. And still to this day, we do not know exactly how many people died, but some people suspect that it could be over 1,000. It's really difficult because there's widely different accounts of the death count based on where people's sources come from. All right, this video We watched in class, worth a watch again if you have the time. And this is another really interesting bit of data to explain to you what the upshot of Deng Xiaoping's new policies were. But all of these numbers, obviously, I would not expect you to memorize, but it gives you a really interesting sense of what kind of changes those policies, how they will affect, rather, the Chinese economy and the worldwide economy, for that matter. Okay, cool. So I feel like the minorities in China are different enough that let me just do a second video. So hang on. Okay, fake out. I feel like I should just do one video. That other one isn't that long. So let's just briefly talk about minority people in China. Again, I feel like you have a pretty firm grasp of this, and we talked about it very broadly. So after the People's Republic of China was founded, the government attempted to set up these semi-autonomous regions that had I guess one could say, majority-minority populations. And what that means is there's not at least when these autonomous regions were set up, there wasn't a significant percentage of Han Chinese people living there. So they had, I call them semi-autonomous regions because even though they did have local governments, they still had to promise that they would remain socialist. And also many of the leaders of these local governments were set up by the greater Han government. Depending on the time period, they would sometimes accommodate for differences in language and customs, but other times not. So, for example, during the Cultural Revolution, there was less freedom bestowed upon minorities in China than there was when Deng Xiaoping was in control. And that's more or less what this statement is getting at. So after this, honestly, this is the reason why I spliced these two videos together, we really let the videos do the talking. So I would rewatch them if you feel uncomfortable with these different groups. But really, just briefly, geography is one of the biggest takeaways. Sorry, I just hit my mic. Hopefully that's not loud. The Uighurs, they're in northwest China in Xinjiang province. They are mostly Muslim. They are a Turkic people. And what else should you know about them? Let's see. You know what? I'm forgetting offhand, but really, again, we were pretty brief with them. But the most important takeaway, honestly, of all the minority peoples, and you would get this from watching these videos, is that this wasn't something that was happening under Mao, and it's history that we should bury, but this is something that's going on to this day, right? Pick up any newspaper, or rather, we don't pick up any newspapers anymore. I sound like such a boomer. Anyway, read a news article online about this, and you'll see what the plight of the Uighurs is right now. All right, so Tibet, very similar stuff, right? This video gets into a lot of really interesting detail about who the Dalai Lama is, why he lives in India and not China, and how, in general, the Tibetans are treated by the Chinese government. And lastly, Inner Mongolia, right? Not to be confused with Mongolia proper. It's not similar to the Tibetans, right? The Mongolians and the Tibetans are different in many ways, but they are both majority Buddhist. And it's their religion that is, to a large extent, the source of the oppression that they experience by the Chinese government. But they also fight with the Chinese over resources. Okay, here we are with South Africa, and obviously I am tired because I feel like I am just going off on tangents tonight. So how about I do the South Africa videos tomorrow, guys? You also can see what time it is. That's it for me. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.